Tired of traditional talk? People pontificating about this or that, the left or the right. Sometimes the truth is just all lost in the noise. Having learned life lessons the hard way, Chuck Gallagher, international speaker and author, cuts through the noise to share truth through transparency. Nationally known guests talk about what's important to you, your life, your concerns, and your success. So tune in, turn on to Straight Talk with Chuck Gallagher. Now, here's your host, Chuck Gallagher.
Hi, this is Chuck Gallagher with Straight Talk Radio, and well, I'm excited that you're joining us today. We're going to talk about a subject that fundamentally will touch every American in some form or fashion. And to start this, I'm going to tell a little bit of a personal story. Back in 2004, I have to get my my decade right. Back in 2004, I went to my local doctor. I had this, I guess it was one of those things where I was maybe a little too vain, and I wanted to keep my hair from falling out. I used to have a four-head. It went to kind of a five-head. For those of you that are seeing this on YouTube, it's continuing to go back. But I went to the doctor because I wanted this pill called Propecia. And my wife had hooked me up with this just beautiful blonde, green-eyed doctor. And I was like, it was so exciting to go to the doctor. You know, it was just a different experience. And she said, you're going to have a blood test. I'm like saying, what? A blood test? Because I hate needles with a passion. She said, yeah, we're going to have to do a blood test because, I need to get a PSA reading. And I didn't know what a PSA was. It didn't mean anything to me. But I guess my vanity was more powerful than the fear of the needle. So I said, okay, went and got the blood test, and I get a call back from the office. I was at a speaking engagement, and they said, your PSA is a little high. We're going to schedule you to see a urologist. And I was like, well, what is a PSA anyway? And they told me it was prostate-specific antigen. And so I went to see this urologist, and he did a few checks here and there, and he said, I think everything's okay, but we need to do a biopsy. And I'm like, will that hurt? He says, no, it's just the sound that'll scare you. Well, number one, that was a lying sucker. That's all I got to say, because there was nothing, it was the most uncomfortable, painful thing I think I've ever had. But nonetheless, when I went back, he walks in the room, looks at me square-faced, and he said, you have prostate cancer. And at that moment, I became a statistic. I became one of 1.6 million people that will be diagnosed with cancer this year. Now, I thought it was, I won't say funny. As I look back on it, I tend to see funny things out of very serious things. But he says, well, there's 4 things we can do, and we probably need to schedule surgery, and we'll do that for next week. And I was like, whoa, time out, Jack. Now, I got to have a little processing time on this. I got to think about it. And of course, I called my wife, and the first thing she said was, you're kidding. And I'm like, no, I'm not kidding. Yeah, you are. I know you are. No, I'm not kidding. And I'm like, why does everybody think I'm telling a joke? Called my boss, told him. He says, you're kidding. And I'm like, no, I'm not kidding. People quit telling me you think I'm kidding. I'm talking about something serious. So the question becomes, what do you do when you've been diagnosed, and how does that impact your family? Here's some stats. 1.6 million people will be diagnosed this year. 62% of caregivers will go into some form of isolation or depression at the onset of the diagnosis. 44% of caregivers are men, and 54 million caregivers caring for the elderly or disabled or chronically ill. And so what we need to do today is we need to talk about this topic. It's a heavy topic, but one that there's a lot of information that can be helpful. My guest is Betty Garrett. Betty Garrett is a dear friend of mine. We met in Dallas, Texas. She actually runs an incredible speakers bureau, and and at the request of a friend, agreed to meet me. She thought I was going to be fat, portly, and old. And I turned out to be a little different than I guess what she expected, but we both have something in common. We're both cancer survivors. But more importantly, Betty has also been a caregiver and founded Caregivers for Cancer. And Betty, thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, Chuck, thank you for having me. It's such an honor and a pleasure. And hopefully our listeners can glean something from what I learned on this journey. But one thing I want to say to you is that, yeah, 1.6 million people will be diagnosed, but today over 14.5 million people have survived cancer. So it's not all doom and gloom, as you well know.
Right. No, it's not all doom and gloom. And you know, I have to be honest with you and say, with the advances in medicine and medical technology, catching cancer at an early stage is actually quite treatable in most cases and quite survivable. And you know, and I'm a perfect example of that, and so are you. So you're right, it's not all doom and gloom, but the other side of the coin is whenever you get that diagnosis, it is such an emotional experience that we have that sometimes we need to be willing to step back, take a breath, and think about what do we really need. And I know you have experienced that personally and with you and your late husband. Tell us a little bit about your story.
Well, Gene had, my love of my life had hiccups. That was the only symptom he had. And he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. And we did not one biopsy, but we did two. Because I was one of those that, no, I don't believe you. You've got the wrong person. You've got the wrong chart, doctor. Let's do it again. So we went and did a bigger biopsy. And sure enough, back in April of 2003, he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. Now, at the time of the diagnosis, remember that your life is changing, and it has changed. Just
Right.
the diagnosis itself. And you now have a new normal. What you experienced prior to cancer is going to be different now. So here's what you need to do, or what I had to do, is there's a couple of things that you can change, and there's things you cannot change. And it's all attitude. Number one, you can't change the diagnosis nor the weather, but you can change your attitude and look at it differently. Yes, it's a new normal.
Betty, let me ask you a question. When Jane had the hiccups and went in and he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, if I can penetrate and ask a really personal question, what was his reaction and what was yours?
Well, interesting that you should ask that, Chuck, because when we left the hospital that afternoon, the silence in the car was deafening. And finally, I said, I can't stand this. I said, okay, Garrett, what are you thinking? Because I didn't know if he was going to go into anger, depression, or what. And all of a sudden, he said the magic words, and they were, Betty, we're going to play out the hand that's been dealt. And when he said that, that gave me the confidence and knowing that we're on the right track mentally. And the other thing I said to him was that, yes, we've got to work together, and you have to be honest with me and not play mind games. So if you're hurting, I need to know. If you don't feel well, I need to know this. We have got to have open communications. Forget the ego, forget macho, forget all of that, because I can't be a good caregiver if I don't know what's going on with you.
Right. And, you know, I think that's really profound. We've got about 3 minutes till our first break. But, you know, to say to get rid of the ego, to get rid of the macho is really pretty significant. And I'm going to say this from a guy's perspective. You know, we aren't as open generally emotionally to sharing.
Yeah.
You know, women who've had breast cancer talk about, well, I've had breast cancer, and you're openly willing to talk about the tatas, so to speak, and then people will go out and put on the pink ribbons and, you know,
Run the race.
But guys who experience cancer, regardless of the type, tend to pull it inward, and the inward isn't necessarily going to be the thing that is best for the patient, but certainly not for the caregiver.
Absolutely, Chuck. And luckily, Jean understood that we had to have open communication or I can't do my job. I was devastated. I was absolutely scared to death. And immediately when we hit the house, we went to the internet and started learning as much as we could about esophageal cancer. Good news, bad news, don't read everything that you can on the internet because it's not always the right information. So get those booklets. There's magazines, there's resources. Go to the American Cancer Society. That's probably one of your biggest resources that you can have. There's a magazine, Coping with Cancer. There's Cure Magazine. There's a ton of resources out there because once you have knowledge, that's going to give you some control as the caregiver. And it will help the patient as well. And if you remember Robin Roberts, when she was diagnosed, she said the three things that got her through it were faith, family, and friends. Well, I have to add a fourth one, sense of humor. Because if you don't have a sense of humor, and like you said earlier, you make light of things that are kind of, dark, but you have to have a sense of humor or you're not going to get through this.
Well, we're here on Straight Talk Radio. My guest is Betty Garrett. She is the founder of Caregivers for Cancer. And one of the first things you said, Betty, before we go to the break is once you have been diagnosed, there is a new normal. And that's absolutely true. We're going to go to break. We'll be back with Betty Garrett in just a moment. Stick with us. We're back with Straight Talk Radio. My guest is Betty Garrett with Caregivers for Cancer, and her husband was diagnosed with cancer, just like I was diagnosed. And you said, there's a new normal. And Betty, I have to say to you, I guess the next step or perhaps next phase is, okay, so, wow, we've been diagnosed. Then what happens? And so I'm going to jump in with an opinion. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's right, but I believe
get me with it.
Yeah, I believe the medical community is well intentioned for care and providing service. But I also believe that we have to understand that the medical community, the doctors are in business, and their job is to do whatever their job happens to be. And so if you've been diagnosed or I've been diagnosed, you said, I went to the internet, and you can't believe everything that you read, but knowledge is power. Because I know my initial doctor said, well, we'll do surgery in a week. No. And then I asked him the question, how many of these surgeries do you do? And he said, well, I typically do 1 to 2 a week. And okay, that was fine, except I went to Johns Hopkins in my case because it was prostate cancer, and that at the time was number 1 for male urology. And my surgeon was doing 350 a year or 1 or more a day. So, I sat back and thought to myself, okay, now let me see. Do I want somebody that does 1 a week or 1 a day? And what is the result? Because I believe people have the right to find out from your medical provider what their success rate is, and if you like them and connect with them, because attitude is everything.
Absolutely. And if you feel, and listen to your intuition, because your intuition is 99% correct at the time. And if you feel like you need a second opinion, go do it. Don't listen to just because he's wearing a white coat doesn't mean he's got all of the answers. And if you want to just be sure, say, I want to have a second opinion, and do it. I was lucky that we had a great medical team that we put together, and we were downtown Baylor and knew that we were where we were supposed to be. And so when the gastroenterologist came out and said what was wrong with Jean and all this sort of stuff, he got into that medical cloud. And when he finished, he said, Ms. Garrett, is there anything you want to ask? I said, yes, sir. He said, what is that? And I said, will you tell it to me in layman's language, Charles, what you just said?
Absolutely.
His face got just as red as a beet, and he apologized. He said, I'm so sorry. I forgot. And see, that's one of the things the caregiver has to realize is that you're dealing with the medical arena, and that's all they know, and that's what they're there to do. But you know your patient better than anybody else because you're with them 24/7. So be sure you feel comfortable with the doctors. And for God's sakes, that's one of the tips I want to share with you that I learned is that get involved with the medical team. I want you to ask those questions, write them down before you go in, have those questions ready, write down the answers, because once you leave that room, baby, you're not going to remember half of what he told you. And I believe that there is really a gap between medical science has done such a great job in sending our loved ones home early and letting them live longer. But because they're sending them so home quickly, they haven't given the caregiver the information that they need.
Right.
And so you have a lot of frustration on the caregiver's part because you don't know what to ask. You don't know what's next and that sort of thing. So when you go in to see the doctor, have your questions ready, and write them down. And if he says something you don't understand, say, Dr. Chuck, I don't understand what you just said. Let me repeat it back to you. And if he says that's not right, I want you to know exactly what the doctor said before you leave that room. And that doesn't mean that you're stupid. It just means you're in a different world that you've never been involved with before. And they want you to be involved.
Yeah, you know, Betty, one of the things that has happened, and this has happened since you and Jean had the first experience, and frankly, it's happened since I was first diagnosed with prostate cancer, and that is technology has created an interesting opportunity. Now, what I mean by that is so I walk in and I'm holding up my handy-dandy iPhone, but I walk into the doctor's office today, and I had back surgery 7 weeks ago, so as a result of that, I've been seeing medical doctors for a while now, for the past 6 months, but I have gone in and said, look, you know, my wife can't always be with me. I want to record the conversation. Right. And I have not had anyone yet tell me no.
They want you to record that. They want you to have that information because that means less calls on the triage once you get home and things start happening. So be sure that you tape record, listen to your intuition. In fact, Oprah, O Magazine, had an article on the inner doctor that you have within yourself. Mm-hmm. So record them, take notes, listen to what they say.
You know,
and go ahead, Chuck.
Well, Betty, I don't know if you've experienced this or not, and my guess is you probably assembled a team that really worked for you. But I have to say, I was with my mother not long ago. She had a back issue. I know we're talking about cancer, but it illustrates the point.
It's a chronic illness.
Right. And we went to her physician. And I'm going to tell you, I could not imagine the difference between mine and hers. He got in, quickly told her what she had, how soon do you want to begin surgery, and was edging out the door as she's asking him questions. And when we walked out, what I said to her was, you are not beholden to that doctor. You can find another doctor. You do not need to go where you are just a statistic.
Absolutely.
He might be the best surgeon in the world, but if you can't get comfortable with who's going to be working on your body, find somebody else.
That's right. And besides that, we had 3 doctors in the medical team, and I got along real well right off the bat, the first 2. The third one was the oncologist, and he was like that. He wanted to get in and get out. And he'd start to get up out of his chair, and I'd say, wait just a minute, I've got another question. Don't you leave.
Right.
And he'd sit back down. But, I mean, he got to the point where he said, now, Ms. Garrett, I'm about to leave. I said, wait a minute, I got one more question. So he got used to that. And we later bonded, but he was the hardest nut, to crack. But
no, I understand.
And also, be sure, and you can tell the doctors no. I know you're thinking, what? If they want to schedule you an appointment, try not to schedule more than 2 in a week because it's too taxing on you and the patient. You have the right to say, no, this is not convenient. In fact, one of the times the oncologist wanted us to be downtown Dallas at 7:30. We live in Irving. That's a 25-minute drive. And peak traffic is not my cup of tea. So it wasn't life-threatening that he'd be there at 7:30, and I knew that. But it was on my doctor's convenience. And finally I said, okay, here's the deal. We are not coming down at 7:30. I cannot be a Christian and drive in this traffic. Do you understand? And he looked at me and looked at his nurse and he said, okay, let's don't test Mrs. Garrett's faith. Give her the 10 o'clock slot. So, it's just something that they forget, that we have other lives.
That's true. And, obviously, especially when you're involved in a cancer diagnosis where there is treatment that is what I'll call more radical and challenging to the patient's body, it really adds that extra level of effort on the part of the caregiver.
Well, I have said all along, it's harder to be the caregiver than it is the patient. And patient can sleep through the treatments and all of that, but we are on 24/7. We are the driver, we're the gatekeeper, we're the note taker, we're everything. And we do not have the opportunity we always have to be on stage. We always have to be on. So it's harder because we wear so many hats. And in our case, I also had the business that I was running. So I was juggling a bunch of balls at the time, and would I do it again? You bet.
Right.
But I mean, you do what you have to do. And the other thing I learned at the onset of the diagnosis, boy, you better get organized, and you better get organized in a hurry.
You mentioned organization. We're pushing up on a break, but I think when we get back to talk about being organized and really what was involved in the process for you to be able to juggle those balls is incredibly powerful. You wrote a book, From Hiccups to Hospice.
Right.
I would suggest, I have read the book, I would highly suggest that you pick that book up. You're holding it up. Yay, great. And pick it up on Amazon.com. It's an outstanding book to help people understand the caregiver's process. This is Chuck Gallagher with Straight Talk Radio. My guest is Betty Garrett, and we will be back in just a minute. Betty Garrett is my guest. She is the founder of Caregivers for Cancer. She wrote a great book called From Hiccups to Hospice, which really talks about caregiving for those people who are helping those of us that have been diagnosed with cancer. And both Betty and I are cancer survivors. And so we really know what that experience is like, Betty, especially in your case, on both sides of the fence. And one of the things that you said was, well, it's important to be organized. And look, as a cancer survivor, I didn't really think so much about what my lovely wife, Debbie, was going to have to deal with or go through. Although in my case, different than Jean, it was a different experience because the solution was a surgical solution. It wasn't one that really involved an oncologist and dealing with the different types of treatment than certainly what I had. So talk to us a little bit about the organization.
Well, get organized. Get yourself a calendar. Get a list and write down all the medications that the loved one is taking. And Chuck, you keep referring to cancer. Yes, Jack, Jean did have cancer, but it's for anybody that's undergoing a chronic illness. Really.
There you go. True.
It really is. So get a list of the medications. And whether you have one of these little phones that you keep everything in them, I want you to have a backup because I want you to put down your emergency phone numbers and keep a copy of them in the car. Because what happens when the battery goes down? You don't have a backup. So I highly recommend getting a calendar or some kind of day timer, or you can put everything in your phone. But when you get ready if you can't take your patient to the doctor or wherever, are you going to give your phone to that person that's going to take him to the next appointment? No.
Right.
So anyway, but write everything down and get those after-hour phone numbers, because emergencies don't happen just 9 to 5. I hate to tell you that. So get those emergency numbers, write them down, have them in the car, have them handy, put them in your phone. And once you're diagnosed, call the insurance agent or call your insurance company and ask for a case manager to be assigned to you, because you're going to have numerous times when you have to call the insurance and ask them about different questions. So get a case manager assigned to you immediately so that when you do have to call them, you deal with that one case manager all through the treatment.
Betty, that's actually a pretty incredible suggestion. And I want to stop you with that, because for people listening, I'm going to tell you, that never crossed my mind. And it seems as if today insurance is more determining what our treatment will be than the doctor gets to determine what our treatment will be. So having a case manager and someone you can connect with to help navigate are we approved, aren't we approved, does it have to be pre-approved, is the insurance going to cover it, well, you didn't get it done in time, and all of the stuff that's just crazy making makes so much sense. Thank you for that.
Well, the case manager was in my case, every time I had a question, I could call her and she would say, the doctor needs to do this and this. And keep in mind, doctor is critical for everything you need, everything you may want. You ask the doctor to write a prescription for it. And then that's key. Don't just go out and buy a walker. Get the doctor to prescribe the walker so that the insurance will pick up the cost.
Right.
So, and the other thing that you can do, and if you go to my website, caregiversforcancer.com, I want you to be able to find those papers, those important papers like, do not resuscitate, your wills, your divorce papers, and all of that. And I want you to go on my website, go to resources, and I want you to print out the life contingency worksheet. What this is that you never know when you're going to need these important papers. And in my case, Gene kept all those papers. But did I know where they were? No. But he knew where they were. So why should I worry about it? So that is the best gift of love you can give to your family, is to fill out that sheet in case you need it. And if you don't need it, you always have it on hand. So get organized. And just to give you an idea, 65% of our time was spent going back from the hospital or to the doctor's office. In fact, 12% of our time was actually going to doctor appointments. 33% of our time was actually going to the emergency room and to the hospital.
Wow.
And then we spent 20% of our time actually going to treatments to chemo and radiation. And if I've done my math right, that should hopefully total up to 65%. But I cannot tell you how important it is. And I kept everything in my day timer. And then after all was said and done, I developed this caregiver companion. It is everything you need. All you have to do is just fill in the blanks, because it has a place for your insurance papers, your notes, your information, the place, your doctor appointments, your questions, your answers, things are you going to do for you, the medical sheets, the calendar. And the other thing is, what would you do for you as a caregiver? Because you have to take care of you, or you cannot be the best advocate and caregiver for your loved one.
Betty, let me ask you a personal question.
Oh, Lord, yes.
What was the most difficult time for you during this experience?
Chuck, when Gene was diagnosed the first time, I thought in my heart of hearts, and I believe that if we followed the protocol and everything, we're going to beat this. And it was hard managing all of the bubbles and hiccups, and God love him. He would throw, snowballs at us, and we'd have to go to the emergency room or whatever the case may be. That was difficult, but the hardest thing, the most difficult, was when he was diagnosed the second time. We were diagnosed in April. We did surgery in June, which was 9.5 hours, and then it came back with a vengeance in January. That's when Betty said, I need help, and I need help now. And I went to Baylor, and I asked for a support group for caregivers, and they had a support group for caregivers and patients. And I said, I don't want one of those. I want one just for the caregiver, for me, because I don't want Gene to hear what's going on with me and how angry I am and how frustrated and overwhelmed and scared. He's dealing with his own issues.
Right.
So being the independent caregiver that I am and determined, I decided that I'd use some of my problem-solving skills and go to Baylor with a list of topics. Went to the right person, and I said, this is what I need, and I need it now. So let's get it started. I don't have time for the bureaucracy. So I will help you if you will just do it internally for me. And she set it up, and we did a support group for cancer caregivers. We did it at lunch, and I would go down to the chemo room and gather up the caregivers and get them to come on upstairs. And
see, there's that extra special phone.
Absolutely.
That's ringing off the hook.
And I am so sorry. But
it's
anyway,
not a problem.
Went down and gathered up the caregivers and said, come on upstairs. This is for you. This is not a hen party. It's not a bitch and moan party. It is strictly for you. It is to share your victories, and it's to share your challenges so that you can leave here knowing you have the answers to whatever is bothering you and your patient today. So we did that, and that was part of my therapy. And then of course, the health went down, and a lot of people don't want to discuss this, but he did go into hospice. And luckily, I had one of my doctors ask me, did I know what hospice was? And I said, yes, but I don't know if I need to take him to a facility, leave him at home, or what. So luckily, that was probably the second most difficult thing. The most difficult was that when it came back with the vengeance. I was not prepared for that.
Right. And I suppose that, and I have not been in this situation. Certainly my wife has worked for hospice, but I have never had to admit someone. So I assume that the acknowledgement of hospice is an acknowledgement of a life transition, not of a successful outcome, at least success by the definition that we would have, which is our partner, our loved one, continuing to live comfortably.
Right. And doctors are reluctant to ask or to admit that it's time for respite care or hospice care because by nature, they want to be the one to treat and give them a good case, solve the problem and send them home.
Right.
But when the oncologist asked me, said, Ms. Garrett, have you done your homework and have you decided on what hospice care you want? And I went, what? I said, I didn't know we were anywhere close to this. And he said, I think we need to discuss it. And I said, well, who do you suggest? And he told us, and I said, well, go make the arrangements. I looked at Gene and he looked at me, and we both had tears streaming down our faces. And unbeknown to me, I said to Gene, honey, I think he's doing us a favor because you're not there yet. But when and if time happens, you're going to be already in the system. So I think he's doing us a favor. However, he told me later he did not expect Gene to last that weekend. And he lasted 2 months in hospice.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
So and hospice, and people don't want to talk about it because of the end result. But I want to tell you something. It is quality of life at that point. So quit the treatments and have the time that you can with them and spend it with them. And because at that point, you really realize during this whole journey what's important and what isn't. You learn that dust on the phone doesn't really matter. If it's not life-threatening, why worry about it?
Betty, I think that's a profound It's a profound statement that you make, and you've written the book From Hiccups to Hospice. I would say before we go to our break, and we're pushing on that right now, that so many times I have seen people go to hospice last minute and really not have that quality time. And you are right. Hospice is not a bad place to be. In fact, it is probably a place that allows for more personal emotional healing than certainly you're going to get in treatments and so forth. But before we get started,
one other thing, people do get out of hospice. Did you know that?
Oh, that's true. That's absolutely true.
Okay.
Absolutely true. With that said, this is Chuck Gallagher with Straight Talk Radio. My guest is Betty Garrett. She is the founder of CaregiversForCancer.com and the author of From Hiccups to Hospice. And we will be back after this short break. Stick with us. Well, we're back on Straight Talk Radio. This is Chuck Gallagher, and my guest is Betty Garrett. She is the founder of Caregivers for Cancer, wrote the book From Hiccups to Hospice, a great book, and she has been talking with us about 5 tips for helping work through this process. And you, Betty, you made a really valid point, and I think I need to reiterate that, and that is this is not just about cancer. It's because of our shared experience that we talk about cancer, but caregiving does in fact apply to many, many illnesses for people that we love. And what you have helps people across the board, not just those that have been diagnosed with cancer. Now, we've talked about 3 of them. I think your 4th one is take care of yourself. And how do you do that if you're a caregiver?
Oh, let me tell you, you ask for help. And asking for help is a sign of strength. It is not a sign of weakness. The first time Jean was diagnosed, I was the independent woman. I was going to do it all and did it all. And then, like I said, the second time it came back, I had no energy. I had no momentum left. So I reached out and asked for my friends. And remember that it's a position of honor for you to ask your friends to help you. Don't do it all yourself. And for those friends who are listening that already know somebody that's in this position, take them out, take the caregiver out of the decision-making mode. For example, call them and say, I am going to the grocery store. Give me your grocery list now. Or I'm bringing dinner at 6 o'clock and I'm bringing fried chicken. Does everybody eat fried chicken or not? Don't ask them, what do you want to eat? God knows I could care less what I eat because I've been dealing with decisions all day long in minutia, and that is the last thing I want to think about is what I've got to prepare for dinner. So surprise me. And if it's during the holidays, put a wreath on the door. Give me a box of thank you notes. I mean, there are a ton of things. And in the book, Hiccups from Hospice is like Chuck said, it is a guide to help you. And there's a long list of things that you can do for the caregiver and for the patient. And call a friend, have them meet you and go have lunch. In fact, one of Jean's sons came up from Houston, and while he was here for the weekend, I went to a show, and I didn't care what I went to see. I just had to leave. And remember, your loved one may need a timeout from you too. So give them that timeout. And the other thing is, Jean knew that I went at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Yes, I have to have my nails done. So he knew that he had to lie still and not cause anything from 3 to 4 because that was the time Betty had for herself. So anyway, that became a joke. But
Betty, as you say that, one of the things that does strike me is as a friend, sometimes we'll say, well, what can I do for you? And the problem with that is you're under stress, you don't know, or you may feel uncomfortable asking. And it is really quite profound just to say, here's what I'm going to do, and then do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the caregiver does not have, they really have so much on their plate that they really don't have time to make that decision. So make it for me. Make it for the caregiver.
What's the last of your 5 steps?
The other thing that you've got to do in order to survive this. Yeah, faith, family, and friends are wonderful, but you better develop a sense of humor, because that, I know it sounds awful because you're undergoing this stressful situation, but laughter allows us to deal with those difficult decisions and start in circumstances. One night we were lying in bed. Jean had lost a lot of weight and we were concerned about it, and we were lying in bed, and all of a sudden out of my brain pops up, Jean, I think we're going to have to start sleeping in separate beds. And he leaned up and he said, what on earth for? I said, do you know those little fat cells you're losing? Yeah. I said, well, those little suckers are finding my side of the bed and they're finding my butt. So will you quit it? So, and I don't know where that came from, but all of a sudden it just popped out. And then the other thing was when Jean was going in for surgery, they allowed me to go into the pre-op room with him and all this sort of stuff. And the two doctors came and they asked me if I had any questions, and I said no. But I was scared to death. I was so nervous, but I couldn't show it. But as they turned around to go put on their scrubs and everything, I said, wait a minute, come back here. And they did. Now here is the chief of staff services, head of the thoracic and all this, head chief and his partner. I said, stick out your hands. Come on, both of you, stick out your hands. And they did it. I said, I want to make sure that nobody had any late night parties and that you've got the shakes, because if you got the shakes, you're not operating on my husband. Well, you should have heard Gene. He went, oh, God. And that was so funny for these two doctors listening to this peon. Here I am wanting you to put out your hands so I can make sure you didn't have shakes. Now, but that was a release for me.
Right. Absolutely.
And you have to do such things like that. And, look at the humor. You'll find it when you're sitting there in the emergency room thinking about things that have happened. You'll find a giggle. And that's all you have to do is find that giggle. Please find something funny, whether it's dark or not.
That's that does raise an interesting memory for me. When I went in for surgery for prostate cancer, it was a robotic surgery. So the guy's sitting there with a joystick. And so my question to the doctors as I was interviewing them is, how good are you at PlayStation and Xbox? Because I figure if you've got, finger dexterity and you can do that, you're going to be good with me. But if you're one of those guys that can't play that thing, buddy, you don't need to be touching this body.
Oh, I know. And
Betty,
yes, sir.
We've got 3 minutes.
Okay.
I got to ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
You have written the book From Hiccups to Hospice. Caregiversforcancer.com is your website, but you were diagnosed later with breast cancer. How did you handle that yourself?
That was interesting because I had not had a mammogram in 2 years. I didn't have time. So finally, one day I had mom in an assisted living. Jean had passed away. Dad had passed away. So I went in and had a mammogram. They found that I had a tiny little speck, and it ended up being what I call the best cancer. If you're going to get cancer, have DCIS.
Right.
So when I went in and had the examination and had the biopsy done, the doctor said he'd call me. So as I stepped off the curb, I will never forget it, I heard Jean's voice, Betty, you're going to play out the hand that's been dealt.
Wow.
And I got in the car, drove home, and I had a piece of me, the peace that came over me, and I knew that I was going to get through this. Now, when the doctor called me, and he said, Ms. Garrett, I want to give you the pathology report. When he said the word pathology, I shut down. And he talked, and finally he said, Ms. Garrett, do you have any questions? I said, Dr. Clifford, I don't have a clue of what you said, because I remembered pathology from when Jean did. So I knew I was in trouble. And he said, come on into the office tomorrow. So I had a friend go with me, because I knew at that point I had to have somebody else to go with me. I had written all my questions down. I even pooled some of my friends to get their input. And so I was lucky that I could do radiation in 5 days. So I did the quick fast. I did the fast lane, and I got through it, and it's done.
So let's do this. We're rapidly running out of time. 5 tips for helping people offer. Give us that one more time.
All right. Once you've been diagnosed, remember, there is a new normal in your life. Remember what you can control, what you cannot control. Get involved with the medical team, get organized, and take care of yourself and develop a sense of humor. Those are the 5 tips that are going to get you through this ordeal, and you're going to get many rewards from that.
My guest is Betty Garrett. She is the author of From Hiccups to Hospice, the creator of A Caregiver's Companion, a beautiful guide, the founder of Caregivers for Cancer. If you have a question or a need, go to caregiversforcancer.com. And Betty, thank you for taking the time to join me here on Straight Talk Radio. And as we wrap up the show, remember, every choice we make in life has a consequence. So let's make empowering, positive choices to create the success that is ours. Thanks. Appreciate you listening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Straight Talk with Chuck Gallagher. Tune in each week on TransformationTalkRadio.com each Monday at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern, as Chuck Gallagher, international speaker and author, cuts through the noise to share truth through transparency. Nationally known guests talk about what's important to you, your life, your concerns, and your success. Visit ChuckGallagher.com for more information and turn on to Straight Talk with Chuck Gallagher.